In the very first pasuk of Parashat Beshalach, in Shemos Perek Yud Gimel Pasuk Yud Zayin, the Torah describes the circuitous route that Hashem chooses for the Bnei Yisrael when they are leaving Egypt, and it provides an explanation for why Hashem chooses that circuitous route over a route that would be more direct. The Torah says, "Vayhi Beshalach Paro es ha'am," when Paro was sending the nation, was sending the Jewish people out of Egypt, "V'lo nacham Elokim derech eretz Pelishtim ki karovu," and Hashem did not send the Jews on the derech eretz Pelishtim, the most immediate and direct route, because Hashem said, perhaps the people will panic, fear will strike their hearts when they encounter war, and perhaps they will return to Mitzrayim. There is a debate among our Mefarshim regarding exactly how the pasuk should be read, regarding how exactly to interpret the words ki karovu and what exactly they mean, what exactly they indicate. But the dominant approach that emerges from many of our Mefarshim, when all the dust settles, is that the war that is referred to in the pasuk is a potential war with the Plishtim that Hashem was seeking to avoid. Rashi begins by explaining that were the Bnei Yisrael to go on a direct route out of Egypt to Mitzrayim, the Plishtim, who were the inhabitants of the land, would come out to meet the Bnei Yisrael in war. They would prepare to fight them. And the Bnei Yisrael would panic when they saw that war, and they would head immediately back to Mitzrayim. Rashi notes that even on the circuitous route through the Midbar, there were points when the Bnei Yisrael had a hava amina, there were points when there were some who suggested that they should return to Mitzrayim. And Rashi says certainly if they were on a direct route that enabled them to return quickly and immediately to Mitzrayim, that is precisely what they would have done when faced with war from the Pelishtim. And again, there are nuances regarding how exactly to read the words of the pasuk between Rashi and the Ibn Ezra, and between the Ramban, but ultimately that is the picture that emerges. Hashem was concerned about a war that was going to occur. He leads them on a different route in order to ensure that that war never materializes. A radically different approach is offered by the Seforno, who suggests that the war that Hashem was concerned about was not a potential war with the Plishtim that Hashem was avoiding, but rather the war with the Egyptians themselves, the war that would indeed occur and materialize when Paro marshaled his forces, readied his chariots, and chased the Bnei Yisrael. The Seforno explains that were the Bnei Yisrael on the direct route from Egypt to Eretz Yisrael, they would have received advanced warning and advanced notice of Paro's impending approach. He says there were many ovrei derech on that direct route. There were many travelers, and those travelers would inevitably spread the news of the time, spread current events. They would tell them, you, Klal Yisrael, face a significant threat from Paro and his armies. They are coming to chase you down. And the Bnei Yisrael, in that moment, when they found out about Paro and his chariots coming, they would have returned. They would have been afraid, not about war with the Plishtim, but about Paro himself and their Egyptian overlords. So Hashem sends them on a circuitous route so they wouldn't receive any advanced warning. And without that advanced warning, they had no choice but to place their faith in Hashem, which ultimately sets the scene for the miracles that will subsequently occur in Parashat Beshalach. One thing that always struck me about this Seforno is that, according to his approach, Hashem is not really avoiding any war that might have happened and might have struck fear in the Bnei Yisrael. All he is doing is controlling when the Bnei Yisrael heard about the war that they would indeed face. And by controlling how they received the news of that impending war, Hashem was able to place them in a situation where they had no choice but to place their faith in him. And I was always struck by this Seforno as a Jew living in the modern world, I guess for two reasons. Number one, we live in an era of information, in which we no longer need to rely on Egyptian runners or travelers on international highways to spread news, but we're constantly bombarded with the latest threat to Klal Yisrael. But we're constantly hearing about what threats loom over the horizon, and they spread instantaneously. We no longer need to travel the Derech Eretz Pelishtim in order to receive that news. It's all around us. And number two, we also live in an era of unprecedented control, in which we really do have much control over our lives and over the direction of our lives in ways that generations past and eons past certainly did not. And we're used to having complete control. And there are many blessings in the combination of those two things. And they certainly impose certain responsibilities. When we do hear of threats, we are obligated to exercise any control that we do have in order to address them, in order to fight them, in order to head them off. But at the same time, that combination also leads to certain significant challenges. Psychologically, it could be quite stressful when we're constantly worrying about the next problem that may or may not materialize. And spiritually, it could be a challenge to our bitachon as well. When we're used to having complete control and we're used to preparing for every single challenge that may arise, we sometimes perhaps forget that ultimately the Ribono Shel Olam is the one who decides the derech on which we are traveling. And in the spirit of the Seforno, I think it's important to remind ourselves of that every now and then. That often we do hear about threats in advance, and again, we should do our part to exercise whatever control we do have. But at the same time, we should recognize that we should place our faith in the Ribono Shel Olam, who throughout our history has dealt with the threats that we face, who has led us on the path that we need to go on, and has ultimately assured our ultimate arrival in our proper destination. And when we place that bitachon in Hashem, may He indeed ensure that we, all of us, follow the proper, safe, and correct path through life, and get us all to the destinations that we need to arrive at. Have a good Shabbos.